one we started talking and the conversation just was flowing, so I just let it go. The guest today is Professor Richard Wolff, the Marxist. That's right, we got him here on the Rebel Capitalist Show. And I wanted to bring on a Marxist, or Professor Wolff, or his view of Marxism, because I think it's important that all of us get outside of our comfort zone or outside of the echo chamber that we're already in, and to hear all views. Just because we understand someone's view doesn't mean that we have to adopt their view. And I've always believed that those who have the best grasp of their own position can argue the other side of the debate just as well. So how can you argue the other side of the debate if you don't even talk to those people? I think hearing all ideas makes your own ideas even stronger. So that's the objective with today's show. Let's dive right into the content.
If you go back to American intellectual life before World War II, you wouldn't find any of this. You would have found not that there weren't people who were scared about socialism and communism and all of that, but you could have a conversation. People picked up books and read them. They listened to socialists give speeches. I enjoy asking my students if they can guess which state in the United States elected the largest number of self-defined socialists to their state legislature. What state out of the 48 on the mainland did that? And they never guess. And then I smile and I say to them, Oklahoma, which is the correct answer.
Really?
Because right. See, you're smiling too, because you've all grown up, we've grown up in a time when that's a hysterically weird piece of historical factuality.
Yeah.
But it was the case. There were more socialists in Tulsa than you can imagine because of the conditions at the time, which made it possible to be a socialist.
Yeah.
In a way that people who grew up in the Cold War, like me, really have a hard time. But anyway, I'd be glad to do that. I am an American. I was born in Youngstown, Ohio. I've lived all my life in the United States, every minute. I've been a professor of economics. I don't know how much you know about me for most of my adult life. The only part of my upbringing that may be a little bit unusual, two parts. One, my parents were immigrants. My father was French and my mother was German.
Yeah.
So I grew up, I was born, as I say, in Youngstown, Ohio. My father was pushing a wheelbarrow filled with steel ingots in a company called the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company, one of the old steel mills that used to be part of that area of the United States.
Right.
So I did grow up speaking French and German, and I've been trilingual all my life because of that. And the other thing is, if you're the child of immigrants, there's an enormous pressure on you to sort of achieve. And I think what's going on there is that my parents' lives were interrupted. I mean, they were yanked out of their society, their culture, their lives, their language, you name it.
Right.
They came to the United States running away from World War II, and they were grateful to come here, but they had to start with nothing. They had no money, they had no credentials that were recognized here, et cetera, et cetera. And so I had to make up, in a way, for them by being the achiever. So the form it took, since my mother was the main person who raised me, and she was German, that means you have to excel basically at everything. You have to be a good student, you have to play a musical instrument, and you have to be active in sports. These are absolute requirements for the appropriate child of an appropriate German mother. And so I did all those things. And I had to, because if I came home either with a bad grade or not having made the baseball team or whatever it was, my parents' sadness was written on their faces in such a way that it was not a psychological possibility for a child not to drive himself or herself crazy trying to meet these expectations.
Yeah.
Long story short, my parents didn't understand what college exactly meant in the United States. So when I was a senior in high school, the whole business of going to college was placed in the hands of the school's guidance counselor. They used to have things like that at public schools in the United States.
Yeah.
And the guidance counselor took me in hand and helped me prepare my applications. Long story short again, I went to Harvard as an undergraduate, and I graduated from there. Then I went to Stanford in California. And then I went and I finished my education at Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut. So the 10 years of my life in the university were spent in the three arguably most Ivy League type of institutions you can imagine. So I'm unusual in the sense that I'm a bit of a poster child for that kind of education.
Yeah.
When it comes to why I would be perfectly comfortable if you wanted to refer to me with the adjective Marxist, is it the only theory that I take seriously? Of course not. Is it something that makes no mistakes and that is perfect? Equally, of course not. I'm not a child, right? I mean, that's all part of the caricature that you referred to before.
Yeah, right.
What did happen to me, though, was an early concern with inequality. And let me give you a little story that'll help people understand it, you might want to use. I grew up in a town called New Rochelle. It's a suburb of New York City. It's about 30 miles outside of New York City in a place called Westchester County. It's a pretty comfortable suburb of New York. And my father took the train into the city every day and came back. He was a classic commuter. And occasionally he would take me with him. And the train passed through a part of New York City called Harlem. Sure. And Harlem at that time was Black, I mean, African-American population, and poor. And the train stopped at a place called 125th Street, if you know New York, which is right in the middle of Harlem. And the train passed so close to the apartment buildings that a child like me could look through the window of the train car, literally, into the living rooms or kitchens of the apartments that were 30 feet away.
Right.
And I remember distinctly asking my father, because you could tell that these people were poor. They were not New Rochelle, which is where I came from, and they were not the downtown Manhattan that I was going to. They were something very different, not just their skin color, but the whole condition of their situation. Right. And I asked my father, what's going on here? And my father was a classic father of the time. He wasn't available very much. I was raised mostly by my mother, and conversations or time with my father were few and far between and very important to me.
Sure.
And I touched something in my father, who then explained to me why African-American people were, I mean, he called them Negroes, because that's what they were called at that time, at least in his circles. And he told me this story, and he did it repeatedly, of how they came as slaves and how they have been victimized and discriminated against, from the beginning, in terms of their jobs and their housing and their education and all the rest. And I think, without being too dramatic here, that it put into my brain two things. One, a question. Why are some people rich and other people poor and other people sort of in the middle? What is that about? But not just as a kind of curiosity, but also with a certain passion, because it was crystal clear to me that my father empathized, sympathized, felt that there was a deep injustice that he was explaining to me. And so I came at this question, and then to jump forward, I asked this question at Harvard, I asked it at Stanford, and I asked it at Yale. And I never got a decent answer. That is, no answer satisfied me. Not only did it not satisfy me, but I began to notice, since I'm reasonably clever, that my teachers to whom I addressed these questions, some of whom, by the way, were very good teachers whom I liked, and others were not.
Were these
But no
economic
matter
teachers?
what?
Were these economists? Were these economic teachers?
Mostly, yes.
Okay, okay.
Some historians, some sociologists, but particularly in graduate school, it was overwhelmingly economists. And I'm talking about economists you've heard of because of the schools I went to. So I took, my first class in political science was taught by Henry Kissinger.
Huh, wow.
My macroeconomics was taught to me by James Tobin. My international trade, Robert Triffin.
Wow, geez.
And on and on and on, because my classmate at Yale, I remember her because she was the only female in the room. My classmate at Yale in my class was Janet Yellen. I know all these people, and they know me, because it's an old boy network. It's a very small kind of community that gets to know each other in these schools. And if you don't understand America's rigidly ranked hierarchy, then you've not been paying attention, because at least in the field of economics, and not only economics, but certainly in economics, it is very, very much in place. And I just wrote it because I happened, largely by accident, to come in there. You know why I went to Harvard? You might enjoy it. My guidance counselor had me apply to 3 schools because I had very good grades. I was on the
I
football
assume
team.
so.
I played football.
How much of your good grades and the success that you've had in academia came from the cultural surroundings you had that were brought to you by your parents? I mean, how much of that was culture? You talked about your mother being German, and therefore grades were incredibly important, excelling in everything. I mean, it seems as though that was a cultural thing.
Absolutely. In my family, it was taken to crazy lengths. The only music that ever played in my household was classical, Beethoven, Brahms, Bach. That was what we could. When I tried as a high school kid to listen to rock and roll and stuff like that, my parents didn't forbid it, but they sure made it. They made it really clear that I had disappointed them by sinking to some cultural low. When I discovered halfway through high school, black blues from the American South, from Louisiana, I loved that music. I still do. I absolutely, find it spectacular. My parents couldn't understand it. For them, music was European opera, European symphony, all of that. So yes, the culture was absolutely crucial. My father, when he asked me the first day of high school whether I was taking Latin and Greek. And I explained to my father that my high school didn't offer Latin or Greek. My father, who trusted me basically, thought I was pulling his leg. I was making stuff up.
Right.
Well, the next day, he marched into the school with me and took me with him. I mean, he wasn't mad at me, but he wanted to, he didn't think this was acceptable. So we went
Trust but verify, right?
Yeah. But he took me to the principal's office. I'm a little high school kid. I'm embarrassed that my father's there. I'm embarrassed by the whole thing. And he's not impolite, but he's pretty forthright with the principal, saying he wants his kid to get Latin and Greek. Why, the principal? Straightforward answers why do you give a crap about this?
Right, right.
And so my father explains that he's the product of the European system, and you don't graduate from the equivalent of a high school in Europe if you have any aspirations for intellectual anything without Latin and Greek. I mean, those are considered foundational capabilities of any self-respecting intellectual, or even an educated person, put aside intellectual. And in a kind of patronizing tone, the principal explains to my father, we've never taught Greek in this high school. I can't do that. I have nobody who can teach. I mean, that's out. But I'll make you a deal. If you can find at least 3 other high school students beside your son, that is me,
Right.
who wants to take we'll go get you a teacher who will teach you Latin. And my father did. And so I learned Latin. As a high school kid, I had 2 years of Latin. I mean, I grew up in that kind of an environment. My father gave me books to read. When I was in high school, he was very critical of the low level of intellectual effort that he thought this school brought out of me. So he gave me stuff to read, and he would talk to me. And by the way, it was psychologically very smart, because I was so interested in having attention from my father. Anyway, so it made a big difference.
So how much of the discrepancies that you noticed as a young child do you think were due to culture, if any at all? Because to your point, in your own upbringing, culture was such a dramatic influence.
Well, I mean, it's true. There was a lot of pressure on me, but, my parents were always interested in, I guess, what you would call world affairs, because
Right.
the world had intruded itself on their lives in a very, very dramatic way. I mean, they had been uprooted from their culture, uprooted from their families, their schools, their friends, thrown to another corner of the world. They had to learn English. They had to make a life here, which they did. But they understood on a gut level, that you better pay attention to world affairs, because they're sure as hell going to shape your life.
Right.
And it will only make you less capable, literally, to survive, but to thrive for sure, if you are unequipped, if you don't know what's going on, if you don't understand what an inflation is, or what military conflict is all about, or what. Those are things you better understand, because otherwise, you may not be able to control them, but being ignorant of them, that's not necessary, and that's only going to make your life worse. Right. So I had an impulse, if you like, to learn these things. My parents were very scared that getting involved with political issues would get you in trouble. So I was heavily persuaded by my parents in high school to go into the natural sciences, to become a scientist. And my mother used to say to me, they don't care what you think. You're in the laboratory with the Bunsen burner, and nobody cares that you're a political person, or you have political ideas. And when I went to Harvard, I began as a biochemist. I mean, I was good at math, so I did mathematics and physics and all of that stuff. But I couldn't stand it, because I was really more interested in the way the world works.
Yeah.
And so I had a kind of catharsis halfway through my sophomore year, and I left chemistry, which I think is what I had moved towards, biochemistry. And I shifted over. I tried economics. I found that so utterly irrelevant to everything I was interested in that I blew right through it. And I wanted to study philosophy, but my parents were convinced nobody hires a philosopher, so I couldn't get a job. So I ended up in history, and I studied at Harvard. I was a history major. But by the time I finished Harvard, I knew that to understand history, I had to learn economics. Right. So then I switched and went to graduate school in economics, and that's why I have the PhD in economics from Yale. Anyway, let me go back to the other thing. I would ask these questions. at Harvard, Stanford, and Yale. Why are the rich rich? Why are the poor poor? Why is it not being fixed? Why has this not been changed? Why has this been allowed? How do you tolerate the loss of all the creativity of poor people who never get a chance to go to school, never get a chance to have an environment in learning? The society loses out on all the creativity. I mean, I had all these questions.
Yeah.
And not only did I never get any kind of answer that was worth anything, I mean, just junk I got, but I understood that my teachers, and this is really important, they were scared. My questions, you know, a student watches the face of a teacher. You ask a question of a professor, whatever comes out of his or her mouth is only half the story. The other half is the facial, you know, the expressions, all those messages that are in your body language.
To hire an employee and interview them, it's not about the resume or what their answers are to the question, how they interact. It's the body language. Yeah,
that's right. All those subtle things that roll around in your head after the person has left the room. Anyway, so I began to notice, and I began to be fascinated with, they didn't know how to answer these questions. But more important, they were rendered exquisitely uncomfortable, even fearful. And I began to wonder, and I began to ask, especially when I would get to know a professor a little bit, and we could, you know, have a cup of coffee or chat a little bit. And then I got it. It was the Cold War. My questions had in them, and these professors were smart, they picked it up, a critical edge. They were questions being asked by a young person discovering there are bad things going on in the world, and I want to understand why they're there and why they happen and why hasn't anything been done about them. And they knew where I was going. I didn't actually know, but they knew, and they didn't want any part of that. They were scared. They were scared about their careers. They were scared about rumors that would spread, that they were leftists in some way.
Right.
A few of them, I was lucky. A few of them I got to know well enough that they actually told me, sometimes with great apology, other times not. And I began to understand that my education was badly skewed, was lopsided, was, what's the word you would want? Biased.
Right.
In a very profound way. And then it kind of came together. So I can summarize it this way. I spent 10 years of my life at Harvard, Stanford, and Yale. You know, a good 20% of my teachers were Nobel Prize winning hotshots. You know, I studied with John Kenneth Galbraith at Harvard. I studied with Tobin at Yale, and on and on and on. And one professor in the entire 10 years, only one professor during one semester assigned me the works of Karl Marx to read. No other professor did that, nor did any other professor give me to read the writings of subsequent Marxists who had taken the theory in other directions, or the debates within Marxism. None of it. And I remember having a kind of epiphany, I think it was at Yale towards the end of my education, when I realized that the Cold War was so extreme here in the United States that otherwise perfectly reasonable people, smart people, good teachers, as well as not so smart and not so good, but all of them had gone so far, not only to be unpersuaded by Marxism or critical of Marxism, all of that would have been fine with me, but to literally, like children, put their hands in front of their eyes and hope that by not looking at Marxism, it would somehow go away. It would somehow be like the scary doggie for the 3-year-old who puts her fingers in front of her eyes and imagines that the scary doggie disappears because you're not seeing it anymore.
Right.
So they excluded the entire corpus of Marxist literature from their knowledge. And so
Richard,
the
don't
minute
you
they
see
the
that
minute they
happening
heard a
today?
student, what?
Don't you see that happening today with, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm not in the US. I don't spend much time there, but what you're describing to me, it sounds exactly what we hear about today, not with Marxism or capitalism, but I mean, I'm not in the universities, but it sounds like if you just mention or bring up the fact that there may be just two biological sexes, there just is a man and a woman, how they treat it maybe even the same way as they treated Marx. It's like it's come full circle and we're doing the exact same thing today, just with different ideas. Do you see that?
Yep. I think that
Yeah.
there's definitely part of what's going on, that you got into habits that are hard to get out of and that don't stop at whatever the topic was that you applied that kind of blindness to in the Cold War. Now you do it
Apply something else. Yeah.
absolutely. I think I have a lot of friends who are Italian Americans, and I remember once asking them, in the 70s and 80s, when the Communist Party in Italy was the second political party, very, very powerful all over the country. And I said, Italy is famous. It's a Catholic country. How is it that so many people in Italy can go to the Catholic Church Sunday morning and to the Communist Party meeting that same afternoon and not find, some psychic dissonance here, some problem? And they asked me, no, the kind of communism you have in Italy, it is the mentality of someone who grew up with the catechism, who learned the rules of the Catholic Church, who feels comfortable in a fairly rigid communist hierarchy that's parallel, in a sense, to the Catholic hierarchy. Mm-hmm. And I remember, it's your point, you take certain ways of thinking or understanding, and then you take them and apply them in other domains. It's a kind of human phenomenon.
I mean, that was one of my main reasons for wanting to get you on the show and talk to you, because I see everyone today, not just in economics, but in everything, they're just in their own little echo chamber, where the only people they want to talk to are people who see the world the exact same way that they do. And I see that as just incredibly dangerous. Yep. And it's just unbelievable to me that people aren't willing to go out and have dialogue, not necessarily even a debate, but even dialogue with people who don't see eye to eye with them. And it just, I think it takes us down a path we don't want to go down.
It's a terrible loss, because, people who think differently from you are going to challenge you. They're going to shake you up. They're going to show you a different way of thinking. And it can have wonderful consequences as you struggle to figure out what's valuable there, what isn't, what are you going to take into your way of thinking. That's how we learn, for Christ's sake. I mean, it really is, it's terribly dangerous on many levels. Anyway, let me finish my story.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, go there. And then on that note, I'd like you to kind of expand my mind and just talk about what your ideas on Marxism are now. Absolutely. And what kind of an ideal, I know there's no ideal, but what would a good system or a better system look like? And then let me try to kind of understand that and maybe interject some of my own ideas.
Good. By the time I finished my education at Yale, I had come to certain conclusions, which is that the capitalist economic system, which I by that time thought I understood, had a whole set of achievements under its belt that I recognized, but it also had huge flaws, huge faults, that my professors needed to pretend weren't there. Professors whom I admired, who were in other areas nuanced thinkers, subtle thinkers, good teachers. But when it came to a balanced discussion of the strengths and weaknesses of capitalism, they were, to be blunt, useless. Useless to one another, useless to themselves, and very useless to me as a student and to my fellow students. And that I now would have to learn it on my own, that these people either knew nothing and told you that, I can't help you here, or dismissed Marxism with a wave of their hand or a curt 3 minutes in a 2-hour lecture, something like that. So I would have to learn, and I am grateful that the libraries at these universities are full of Marxist literature. So if you want to learn it, it's there. It's just you got to do it on your own.
Right.
So I was not alone in any of these universities. So groups of us who were interested began to learn and study, and that's how I came to it. Now, moving to the present and to your question. I've lived a fairly long life. I taught at Yale for a while, then I taught at the City University of New York for a while. But most of my adult time, I've been a professor at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. That's the main campus of the University of Massachusetts. And I now teach at a place called the New School University in New York City, where I live. I'm more of I'm a Marxist because I think Marx has a lot to teach us. I'm a little bit feisty, so since it has been so difficult for people to be Marxists, I kind of enjoy sticking the adjective on my forehead. So,
you enjoy being a lightning rod.
A bit, and I enjoy kind of shaking people up by saying, not only am I a Marxist, but I'm grateful to Marx. I'm happy that I've understood things with the help of Marx. And I'm sad for you if you haven't learned what there is to learn from Marx. But I mean, between you and me, is Marx my only teacher? Of course not. Is he the only person who has shaped my thinking? Of course not. Right. Are there problems and flaws in Marxism? Absolutely. I mean, that's what any rational person, I think, would say. And that would be true of Austrians or of Adam Smith or anybody else.
Yeah.
I like to remind people, because Americans don't know, that Marx's most famous work is Capital, 3 volumes, Capital. But there's another 3-volume work called Theories of Surplus Value, also Marx, very little known. In those 3 volumes, which are available in English and many other languages, if you get those 3 volumes, you will see the huge portions of them are devoted to Marx's detailed analysis of the works of his predecessors, including Adam Smith, right, David Ricardo, all kinds of those, the great founders, if you like, of modern economics. Marx is unusual. Marx is unusual because he is better schooled in what went before him than 99.9% economists since. He really, by the way, deeply respectful of the things he learned from Adam Smith, from David Ricardo. None of this cheap, oh, they're wrong or they're not important. None of that. The opposite. And I remember working through that, learning a lot about Adam Smith and David Ricardo that I hadn't understood. My teachers couldn't tell me because they had run away from seeing how those folks looked through the eyes of Marx. But the thing that I most importantly came away with that I would share with you is that what distinguishes Karl Marx from Adam Smith, David Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, people like that, was that Smith, Ricardo, Mill, they celebrated capitalism by and large. They thought it was an important advance over the pre-existing system, feudalism. They welcomed the transition from feudalism to capitalism. They were boosters. They were celebrators. And I've always told my students, read them, because you will understand capitalism through the eyes of people who like it, who want it, who celebrate it. But like with any rational intellectual endeavor, you've also got to ask the question, are there critics of capitalism? Are there people who have devoted the kind of systematic analytic to capitalism from the standpoint of a critic so that you can read them also and then draw your own conclusion about the system you live in, having heard the arguments of those who love it and heard the arguments of those who are critical, who don't like it, who think the human race can do better. Marx is the leading thinker of the critics, the way Smith and Ricardo were the founders of the celebrants. Mm-hmm. But my education was deficient because we got all the celebration and no criticism.
Right.
And what that gives you is a really limited, crappy, superficial grasp of what's going on. And I have to tell you, I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but I have to tell you, that has not changed. That is as bad in American academia today as it was 20, 30 years ago. The Cold War may be over in the sense of Russia versus the United States. But in the economics departments of colleges and universities, the dominance of capitalism celebration is as strong as it was back then. That, in my judgment, is a tragedy and means that the economics knowledge of the United States is as badly misdeveloped or underdeveloped today as it was back then. And if you pushed me, I would even go further and tell you the terrible mismanagement of the three crises capitalism has already had in the 21st century. The dot-com crisis in 2000, the subprime mortgage crisis in 2008, and the so-called COVID-19 crisis we're living through now have been so badly mismanaged, which is why, of course, we have three, each one worse than the one before, partly because the critical understanding of capitalism, which might have helped you handle it better, is not present. It's just not there. And that is a very serious problem. All right, now to the Marxism.
Yeah, like, so what would, and I'm going to write some notes here because I'd love to circle back to 2008, the dot-com and whatnot. But as far as a better system, or a system that you think would be more equitable, or for whatever reason you think would be better, how does that system look? I mean, how does private property work? How does the system work from a standpoint of producing goods and services?
Let me, if you don't mind, let me start with what the Marxist critique of capitalism is. I'll make that very brief, and then the alternative.
Sure.
Okay?
Sure.
All right. The critique of capitalism really, it can be boiled down to very few basic items. The system is unstable, the system is unequal, and the system is unjust. And any one of those is a sufficient reason to argue that you can do better than capitalism, but all three of them, it becomes overwhelming. Very briefly, what do I mean by unstable? If you chart the history of capitalism as beginning the modern version of capitalism, somewhere in the 17th century in England, and spreading from there to Western Europe, and then the rest, now to become the global system, every 4 to 7 years, wherever capitalism has settled, it has had a crash. Sometimes the crashes are short and shallow. Sometimes the crashes are long and deep. But crashes every 4 to 7 years. Once again, here we are on year number 20 in this new century, and we've had 3, i.e. every 7 years, every 4 to 7 is the average. What do I say about this? Every 4 to 7 years, millions of people are thrown out of work. Tens of thousands of enterprises go belly up. Communities suddenly lose their tax revenue and are plunged into all kinds of crises that magnify the difficulties of the people thrown out of work. If you lived with a roommate as unstable as capitalism, you would have moved out long ago. This is a system that is very, very unstable. And yes, people have accustomed themselves to instability, but that's a little bit like celebrating the people of Pompeii in Italy because they accustomed themselves to the volcano erupting every few weeks or months,
Vesuvius.
until the time came when they couldn't accommodate anymore because they had become overwhelmed by it. My suspicion is we're at that point now. I don't see a way out of the crisis of capitalism we're in now. And this is the first time in my life that I feel this way. So we really are in a very, very bad place. Anyway, it's very unstable, and the idea that we can't do better than this is childish. Capitalism has tried to get rid of this instability from the beginning, tried every which way to overcome it. We even developed a whole other kind of economics called Keynesian economics, after the name of the fellow in England who, in the depths of the Great Depression of the 1930s, wrote a book called The General Theory, in which he tried to come up with a way for the government to step in to overcome this instability. Sure. Every president since Franklin Roosevelt has at one point or another during his presidency had a downturn and made the same promise. We must do the following things. These are my policies to deal with the crisis. We have to do it. And if we do it, not only will we get out of this crisis, but we will not plague our children and our descendants with this kind of a crisis ever again. Every president made the promise. No president ever delivered on that promise. Look at us now. We're in one of the worst we've ever had, second only to the Great Depression. So the instability is inherent, it's endemic, and it has not been solved by this system, nor is there any prospect of that happening. Number two, the system tends towards inequality. It always has. That fellow in France, whose name right now escapes me, who wrote the book Capital in the 21st Century, published in 2014.
Piketty.
Piketty, Thomas Piketty. His book, 600 pages, which I must be one of the handful of people who've actually read it, it's a demonstration that wherever capitalism exists, it creates greater and greater gaps between rich and poor, both in terms of income and in terms of wealth, and that this process is only stopped or reversed when there is an explosion from below demanding that this stop. Then you have a period of 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. We had that kind of a moment in the 1930s. Inequality was reversed during the Great Depression. We became much less unequal. But as soon as that was behind us, the normal capitalism after 1945 took place again. And once again, we are very, very unequal. And capitalism has always done that. It has likewise countless efforts been made to offset the inequality. But whether you look at Sweden in Northern Europe, or you look at China today, or the United States, you see capitalism, in my judgment, everywhere and everywhere producing growing inequality that usually ends up with a social explosion that temporarily slows it down.
Yeah, and the challenge is we don't want to be equally poor. So that's the challenge, is how do we be equally rich?
Yeah, absolutely. Nobody's interested in being equally poor. Right. The question is, how do we solve the problem? But capitalism has never solved the problem. We have the problem now of it depends if you include China or not. China is the great statistical anomaly right now. But if you remove China from the equation, then the inequality is as terrible. The Chinese have done an absolutely extraordinary feat of economic development. Maybe I'll mention that now because it's provocative, but it'll give you an idea of what you need to think about. The great economic success story of the 20th century was the Soviet Union, and the great economic success story of the 21st century is the People's Republic of China. Both of those societies called themselves socialists. What is it that they accomplished? They went from the poorest of the poor to modern superpowers. That was the goal of the vast majority of the people of the world, was to stop being poor and become whatever you want to call the alternative, middle class, rich, developed, it doesn't really matter.
Increase in standard of living, yeah.
Yeah, and when I say this, I'm just describing to you the factuality that any economist, right winger, left winger, or center, knows to be the case. I am not endorsing the Soviet Union or celebrating or saying that they don't have all kinds of problems. They did, they do. But if your calculus is that you put a priority on not being poor anymore after centuries of extreme poverty, then the Soviets went from the poorest European country, savaged by World War I, and then again by World War II, to be a superpower second only to the United States by 1975. There is no comparable history in the 20th century to what they achieved. And if you want to look at our century, young as it is, there is nothing comparable to what the People's Republic of China has accomplished. The largest country in the world, the extremes of poverty there. If you ever have a chance to look at the novels of Pearl Buck, written years ago about China, you get an idea of what the conditions of that country were. And now they are, you know, within a decade, they will be a larger economic unit than the United States.
How did
So
they achieve that, Richard? China.
they achieved it very similar to the Soviet Union. They made a priority and they said the following: we are going to use the government as the mobilizing agent that will mobilize the people, the natural resources, the power of the international market. That's more important for China than for Russia. The international market basically did not allow Russia to enter the world economy. The Chinese made a decision, fateful decision for them, that they would not only enter the world economy, but that they would build their economic growth on the world economy by becoming the export powerhouse that they are today. But they were able to achieve an efficient mobilization of their productive resources that puts private capitalism out of the running. I mean, there's no contest. Let me give you an example. Let me give you very important.
Sure.
Over the last 25 years, the average annual growth of GDP in the United States about 2%, maybe 2.5%.
Right.
Over the same 25 years, year after year, the economic growth in China is 3 times that, somewhere between 8 and 10%, or depending on how you count. That's an unsustainable arrangement. That's why they are where they are. That's an achievement no one has ever seen before. And the recognition now by the United States and a little bit by Europe that they got a problem in China, that's going to be a wonderful historical story of way too little and way too late. You know, that chicken is gone. That horse is out of the barn. You didn't do it right. The United States benefited enormously by the economic development of China. One of the reasons the United States has the profit rates it does is because you were able to deliver to the American working class very cheap consumer goods.
Right.
And those were only available from the People's Republic of China. China can outproduce the United States, and that's been true for 30 years. All that the Chinese needed was someone to distribute it in the United States, because they didn't have any distribution mechanism. And so 30 years ago, they made a deal with an obscure company in Arkansas called Walmart. And Walmart became the distributor of the Chinese commodity, giving the working class a cheap consumption, allowing real wages to stagnate since the 70s, while productivity in America kept going up, creating the inequality that we've talked about.
And all we have to do is send them our green pieces of paper.
That's right. And now they are the biggest creditor of the United States, which is the biggest debtor country in the world. And they will use that creditor status when they need to if and when the United States graduates from the kind of pecking at China that they've been doing, mostly political theater, the Huawei Corporation, TikTok, arresting the executive, the president's daughter in that Huawei company, and so on. If and when they try to do something significant, the Chinese will wrap the United States right across the face with that credit among the many other tools they have, but have not yet deployed because they don't need to.
Yes.
Anyway, let me come back
Yeah, go
and
to
answer
China
your.
because I mean, what I would assume, and maybe I'm not correct, is that the way China became more powerful economically is by creating more of a free market system that incentivized individuals to take risk and to grow companies and produce all those goods that you're talking about for Walmart.
Right. I'm always fascinated by this, so don't take this personally.
No, no.
I love the idea that when you see a stunning success like China, it is so disruptive of the ways that people have of thinking that they comfort themselves by saying, gee, okay, they really did something impressive, but that's because they were mostly like us. In other words, they adjusted to be more like us, and that brought them the good news. I mean, I understand what you're
Well,
saying.
they didn't adjust more like us. Let's say they adjusted more like Singapore or someone not us.
Okay.
But wherever.
Well, no, I'm sorry, you're right.
Just,
I meant us as private capitalism.
sure, sure, sure.
There's no, we agree. The Chinese made a commitment to allow private capitalist enterprises inside China, both by Chinese citizens and foreign, Japanese, American, British, German, French, and all that.
Right.
So no question they did that. And no question that was part of the success they had. But I would like to remind you, the Communist Party is the dominant economic director of everything in China. They tell the people what is going to happen. They make planning decisions, growth decisions, investment decisions, monetary decisions, interest rate decisions. The power of the government in shaping the economy of China is what most of the world calls socialism. You know, the Northern Europeans call their system socialism, the Swedes, the Danes, the Norwegians, and so on. And what they mean is that they have private capitalist enterprises, but a very strong government supervision, intervention, regulation, however you want to put it.
So is that what you see more optimal than what we have?
No,
Okay.
I'm going to come to that in a minute.
Okay.
But what I would say, if your goal is to mobilize all the resources of a society around certain priorities, then that works better than the private economic systems that we celebrate here in the West.
Okay.
Our government is rendered incapable of that kind of mobilization. One of the few things we allow the government to mobilize around is war. But short of war, we don't do that. And that's partly because we are committed to hobbling the power of the government. That's why you can find societies around the world that are staunchly pro-capitalist, but in which they trust and empower their government. And that's why they've done so much better in the priority fight against COVID-19. I mean, look at Denmark, look at South Korea, look at New Zealand. These are capitalists, these are countries dominated by private capitalist enterprises, and they always have been. But they did way better. Why? The minute you look, because in their societies, for cultural reasons and political reasons, the government is given enormous trust by the people. We don't do that in America. Enormous confidence in their ability to mobilize resources. We don't have that in America. And they're given real power to commandeer both public and privately owned resources for the priority targets the society accepts. And we do that in war, but we don't do that hardly anywhere else. They do it across the board and all kinds of objectives, and they are doing better in fighting this COVID than we are, even though in this country, because of the ideological blindness, this failure to give the government the respect, the power, the confidence, if you like, of the mass of people cannot be criticized So we may be angry at Mr. Trump, but we don't get angry at the structure, which is much more important in the failure of the Trump administration than anything that orange clown does. It's not, it's an inappropriate focus on an individual.
What's the downside to the government having that much power?
All kinds of risk. The government can abuse that power.
Because it just seems that if you get the wrong guy or gal in power and the government has that much power, then you got big problems. But
You
I mean,
do.
it's always a cost-benefit analysis, right?
I agree with you. I agree with you 100%. I just want you to remember, like any good thinker, that if you don't have a strong, powerful government, you are taking big, fat risks. The United States has 4% of the world's population, 4.5%. We have 25% of the COVID-19 cases and 25% of the COVID-19 deaths. We are the richest, or arguably one of the richest countries in the world. We have only 4% of the world's population, but we have failed as a society because we got 25% of this disease, which we cannot, to this day, we cannot mobilize our government's resources. I tried 2 weeks ago to get tests for this. I have to wait. There are no tests in a country that has been, we're now, I believe, about 188,000 dead people, dead Americans from this disease since late March of this year. I mean, that's unspeakable. What in the world? So I would only argue with you, yeah, you've got risks if you give the government that much power, but you've got really big risks if you don't. You got to work out that contradiction rather than pretend, which my left-wing friends, they think the government's going to do it all and do it all wonderfully, end of story. Right. Or, and now don't take this personally, my friends on the right who imagine if you get rid of the government, it's going to somehow solve itself. I don't see that. Let me answer though, because of the interest of time too.
Yeah.
Let me tell you about socialism, okay, and Marxism. There are three kinds of socialism that are struggling in the world today. And what do I mean? Like all great thinkers, the work of Marx has been interpreted differently. You know, the way in Islam you have Sunni and Shia, different interpretations of that. Or in Christianity you have Protestants and Catholics, or you know, every great text, every great tradition of thought,
even with the Keynesian economics,
yes, spawns different interpretations. Let's look at Marx and socialism. Marx dies in 1883. So what are we saying here? 150 years, more or less. That's all. During the 150 years from his death in 1883 to now, Marxism has spread to every single country on the face of this earth. Every country has Marxist professors, Marxist labor unions, often Marxist political associations, Marxist political parties. China and other places have Marxist governments, that is, they describe themselves that way. It's the spread of a set of ideas that is as historically remarkable, if not more so, than anything else. It spread further, faster than Christianity did, or Judaism, or Islam, or any other. A. B. That means it is somehow extraordinary that people in such different levels of cultural, political, economic development all found something very meaningful that brought them into contact and made them absorb in their own way Marxism. Last point. Because they had all these different cultures, Asian, African, Latin American, European, you name it, they, of course, came up with different interpretations. The interaction between Marx's writings and their particular culture produced multiple contesting interpretations.
Right.
Bottom line, Marxism and the socialism that it celebrates have always been contested terrain. It's always been different, so that when someone writes, the Marxist view of something is, you should stop reading because this is a waste of your time. There is no such thing as, it's as if you took a course in religion and the professor began teaching, and all you heard about in each lecture was about the Baha'i religion. After a while, you'd raise your hand and you would very respectfully say to the professor, look, I have nothing against Baha'i. I'm glad we're learning about Baha'i. But I took a course in religion, and religion isn't just Baha'i. You got to tell us about, So for me, one of my problems is, in a country as backward on this subject as the United States is, I have to explain that there have always been contesting ideas. Is there something they all have in common? Yeah. It's the notion that you can do better than capitalism and that the world would be better off if it did make a transition to the next. It's the view that just like previous systems, slavery, feudalism, whatever you want, that these are systems that were born, they evolved over time, and then they died. And that the burden is on anybody to suggest that capitalism, which we know was born, and capitalism, which we know has evolved, is not now facing the next stage, which is dying. I don't know when and I don't know how, but I'm confident that it isn't the end of human history. And it strikes me that the burden to argue otherwise is on those who would claim that it is. So the socialists believe, yeah, we can do better. How do we do that? Answer. What socialists agree on. One of the ways, and this is particularly in the 19th and 20th century, one of the few things they agreed on, well, not 100%, but mostly, was that the way socialists should proceed is that they should take advantage of what they're good at, and that was mobilizing the mass of people. Because capitalism is a system that puts a minority of people in a dominant position. What do I mean? In slavery, you divided production between master and slave. In feudalism, you divided production between lord and serf. In capitalism, you divide the production between employer and employee. It isn't all that different. The employer calls the tune. The employer decides what's to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the net revenue, the profit, the surplus, whatever you want to call it. And that's what the master did relative to the labor of the slaves. And that's what the lord did relative to the labor of the serfs. So the notion that capitalism is a big advance over what went before gets you a kind of ironic skepticism from a socialist. And
that I would take exception to, but please continue your point.
I just want you to see how the logic works. I mean, I'm not expecting you to agree. And so the advantage socialists have, they argued in the 19th and 20th century, is that we're speaking to the mass of the people. The great majority are employees, not employers. So here's our strategy. Use the reality of universal suffrage, or at least however much suffrage there was, and take over the state. Grab the state apparatus by mobilizing the mass of people, and then use the power of the state to make the transition from capitalism to socialism.
Right.
What did that mean? Well, for example, that in the latter half of the 19th century, the great debate among socialists, who agreed with what I just said, was how you grab the state. And there were those who wanted to use peaceful parliamentary means, organize a political party, run candidates, all of that. And then there were the revolutionaries who said, no, they'll never let you do that. You have to seize the state by means of a revolutionary upheaval or a revolutionary
violence.
Yeah. And then the question of violence arises absolutely as part of that. So you had the German model, which was more parliamentary. And you had the Russian model, which was Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, and the revolutionary overthrow. Here's what happened. To the surprise of Marxists, they were right and they were wrong. They were right that they did have a very powerful appeal to the mass of employees. I mean, the most incredible example was the German Socialist Party, which begun around 1870, and by the end of the century, 30 years later, was the #2 political party in Germany. So they were able to show you can do a lot, inspired by Marx, who was the official icon, if you like, of what they were doing. But the Russians had a very different experience. They were blocked and thwarted by their society, could not form a political party that could run candidates. So they made a revolution rather than a parliamentary road to power. But to the surprise of all of them, it didn't take anywhere near as long. They thought it was a matter of centuries. It wasn't. It turned out to be a matter of decades. So in 1917, you have the first successful seizure, if you like, of national power. You had a dry run, very important in socialism. And the dry run was the Paris Commune of 1870, when radicals, including Marx's followers, Marx was still alive then, grabbed power in the city of Paris and held it for about 3 or 4 months. And they learned many lessons about how workers could assume political power. And I don't know if you're familiar with this, but Lenin writes very important pamphlets in terms of shaping the consciousness of the leadership of the Soviet Union, in which he tries systematically to apply the lessons learned in the French Commune by Marx and his followers to the conditions 40, 50 years later in Russia at the beginning of the 20th century. So they take power. Okay, now they have achieved it. And man, let me assure you, they were surprised, because the political party, the Bolsheviks that took power in 1917, were a tiny political party in a huge society, most of whom had never heard of that party, let alone been part of it. So the question becomes, okay, how do you use the state to make the transition? And this is really crucial for you to understand. The first thing is you have to protect yourself. You're going to be attacked by all the capitalist countries who are terrified and shocked that these anti-capitalist movement has seized power in an important country. So let me remind you of the history in case you're not familiar. Within a year after the revolution in Russia, 1917, 4 countries invade Russia to overthrow the new Soviet regime: Britain, France, the United States, and Japan. The United States landed 10,000 troops in Russia to work together with the White Army in a civil war against the communists and the Red Army that they had mobilized, a war which lasted from roughly 1918 to 1922. So self-defense was the first priority of this new Soviet government. Trotsky was given the job: create a Red Army strong enough to defeat not only the White Army, that's Russians against the revolution, but their allies, the Japanese, French, British, and Americans, who were the 4 strongest anti-capitalist countries at that time. Okay, and they won. The Red Army won, the White Army lost, and the last foreign troops left in 1922. Lenin dies that year. In 1923, Lenin dies, has a brain aneurysm and dies. Very important, because he was the intellectual leader of all of this.
Yeah, since Stalin came in, right?
Yeah, after Lenin is dominant, Stalin, Trotsky, and a whole bunch of others are secondary, let's call them. And when Lenin dies, a struggle begins. Who's going to be the next leader here? And Trotsky loses that struggle and eventually is forced into exile, dies in Mexico in 1940. And Stalin, by the end of the 1920s, is the new power. And so we can tell the story in many ways, tell it around Stalin. He now is in charge of the state. And what does he do? He wonders to himself, how do we make a transition given what we did after the revolution? In order to win the revolution and in order to win the Civil War, what the Soviet Union did, and I'm about to tell you this partly because the history is crucial, but partly because I think it will surprise you, because if you are an American like most others, and I don't know you, so this may be wrong, no one ever taught you the history, so you never understood what any of this was about. And it's not your fault. The only way that that revolution was won was the decision by Lenin, more than anybody else, that the commitment of the revolution would be to give the Russian peasant, Russia at that time is a 95% peasant society. It's an agricultural society, has very little industry. To give every peasant his own, is very important, private property in land, which for every peasant was the be-all and end-all of what they had hoped for and what they had not had for centuries. In other words, simple English, the communist revolution in Russia was the greatest event establishing private property in the means of production in the history of Russia. The notion that the Soviet Revolution is a revolution against private property, only a country besotted by the Cold War without any understanding of what actually happened could say such a thing. When I have to sit in academic seminars, which I still do, and I listen to some esteemed professor, often saying interesting things, start talking, there is this moment in which I have to make a personal decision. Am I going to be a nice guy and kind of explain what's wrong, or I'm going to wrap this fellow across the knuckles because, I mean, what are you doing here? Stalin came across and discovered that by the end of the 1920s, the private property in land that had been given to the Russians by the revolution was becoming an obstacle to the revolution's growth. Why? Because those private peasants, they wanted to keep what they grew. They wanted to keep the profits from whatever product they sold in the markets. By the way, free markets all over the place. Again, the communist revolution established free markets all over the place. They wanted to keep it, but Stalin by then realized that his only survival was to build up a military, and since he could not deal with the rest of the world by trade, he had to build up heavy industry. So he needed, to make it in economics, he needed to pull a surplus off the agriculture in order to make it available in the cities to feed and provision raw materials for the building of an industrial powerhouse. And the peasants to whom they had given the land didn't want this. They wanted to develop their own well-being, understandably. This led to something called the collectivization of agriculture at the end of the 1920s into the 30s. As part of that, Stalin builds a very powerful state apparatus because he's going to have to smash the opposition of the peasantry, the vast majority of the Russians, upon whose support the communist government counted in order to fund the industrialization without which he thought the country couldn't survive. Terrible problem. Solution, an enormous empowerment of the state, which went so far, here comes the punchline, for Stalin to declare socialism has been achieved. Up until that time, the Russians didn't say that. They said socialism is an intermediate stage. The government takes over, but it's because it's going to move the society, transition to a further state. Right. Socialism is intermediate. Stalin gave a very famous speech, which I made the basis of a book, in which he said, after the revolution, He says, you know what we have here in Russia? We have state capitalism. Well, all we have done, he's very self-deprecatory. We have thrown out the private owners of the means of production. We've replaced them with the state. We're the employer. We didn't do away with the employer-employee relationship, which is foundational to capitalism. We just changed, right? We just changed who the employer is. And that's all we've done is establish state capitalism, his phrase. The task of our government now is to go beyond state capitalism to achieve the very equality, justice, all the things in the name of which we made the revolution. Stalin breaks from that and says, no, we have achieved socialism. Why? Because we have a powerful state that owns and operates the industrial structure of this country, which is our #1 priority to develop. And that split the global socialist movement, split them right down the middle, so that you had already before the split between communist parties and socialist parties that happened right after the Russian Revolution. But now that split became much more profound because for the socialist parties, there were these long-term objectives that they got. And the communists said, no, we don't have a long-term objective. We've arrived. We got socialism. And here's what socialism is. When the government takes over industry and agriculture, runs it, and coordinates everything through a plan, distributes the goods and services both to the public and to the interactive enterprises, no market planning, no private property, socialized property. And that becomes the 20th century definition of socialism.
So you're saying that's inaccurate?
What? No, I'm coming to. It's not a question of inaccurate. Remember, it's differences.
Got it.
Right? So the Western European, the Scandinavian, the German, the French, to this day, for them, socialism is a government that intervenes to make capitalism less harsh, less sharp-edged, give everybody health insurance, give everybody subsidized education, give all the things that Western Europe is famous for giving the mass of people, all of which were achieved over the opposition of private capitalists by a socialist party. You know, the socialists are the government today in Denmark. The socialists are the government today in Portugal. The socialists are part of the government in Germany, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Mr. Macron in France, who's the current president, was an official of the Socialist Party until he changed parties 4 or 5 years ago. I mean, so socialism in Europe means the government regulating a private capitalism. No, say the Soviets, that's not what we are after Stalin. Socialism, we're not going to call it socialism unless the government goes well beyond regulating the private capitalists. The government must displace or replace the private capitalists so that the board of directors of the corporation, the share owner, the only share owner, is the government, and it's government officials that sit there. Okay, and then you have the history of Russia and China. We talked about that. From the beginning, there were other socialists who said, we don't agree with socialism as the state regulating private capitalism. And we don't agree with the Soviet Union, which equates socialism with state capitalism. We don't agree with that. We're socialists, but those are not acceptable to us. Why not? Well, here comes your story. This is too much power in the hands of the state. It's too much power unanchored, uncontrolled from below, so it's inconsistent with the socialist idea. So this, we have to construct, and by the way, I say we because I'm in this third group. I agree with that. I criticize the Scandinavian model and I criticize the Soviet. These are not, for me, what persuades me. So we, now me included, our argument is that state capitalism is the right description that Lenin gave for Russia at the time. State capitalism is also what we have in People's Republic of China to this day.
Right.
It is a state capitalism that allows a sizable private capitalism to coexist with it, which is very interesting that they did that. The Russians did not do that. By the way, Russian economic growth, very, very impressive, but it did not include a big private capitalist sector, which is why the argument that China is successful only because it has it doesn't work, because you can't explain Russia, which was the model, and which also grew very quickly because it didn't have the private sector. In any case, our criticisms, to make a long story short, you have to deal with the contradiction that what the state capitalism was able to achieve in Russia and China was paid for at the price of a government with too much power, which it abused politically, culturally, in terms of civil liberties, civil rights, all of that. And that has to be faced. And we have to come up with a critique. And so here it is. The transition from capitalism to something better has to take into account that story I summarized for you before, namely that master-slave morphed into lord-serf, morphed into employer-employee. Dichotomous positions in which the power and the wealth accumulated at one pole, the minority, at the expense of another pole, the majority. That socialism always represented the demand, the commitment, the dream to go beyond that. But that the socialists who took power in Russia, in China, in Cuba, in Vietnam, for a whole host of reasons, either could not or would not or both take the steps that were necessary to both embody the socialist dream and protect against the abuse of centralized power. So what was it that needed to be done? Answer: the democratization of the enterprise. Socialism only dealt on the macro level. The government was going to come in and do this, that, or the other.
Right.
But what was missing was the recognition that you had to have a transformation at the base of society, inside the enterprise. You could not solve the problem by replacing the private employer with a state employer. This doesn't change the foundation of the society. The way to change it is to change the enterprise. That what socialism means, must mean, as the way of learning from the early experiments, Russia, China, which were the first big experiments in how to go beyond capitalism. You have to learn what they achieved, but you also have to learn where they screwed up, where they did bad things you don't ever want to repeat. And the way you do that, in the minds of the socialists, Marxists who use Marxist analytic, is to say, here's the answer to the question you asked at the beginning. There ought not to be the employer-employee dichotomy inside the enterprise. Okay. That what socialism should represent, what it should mean, what its argument must be, is the radical democratization of the enterprise.
And of private property. So instead of the employer owns the entity, the employees do, but there's still private property.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Notice as I speak, there's no notion that the government doesn't have to own anything here. Right. This is something in which the workers, think of it this way, it becomes a community. Right. The workplace is a community. One person, one vote in this community. What does this community decide? What to produce, how to produce, what technology, where to carry out the production, and what to do with the net revenue that this collective effort entails. And this is now to be decided by the workers, who thereby become collectively their own employer. It's the dream of self-employment, where the self is the collection, equal, one person, one vote, of all the people in an enterprise.
Mm-hmm.
And the modern language in English is usually worker co-op. That what we're talking about here is a transition from the hierarchical, top-down, dichotomous employer-employee model of the enterprise to the worker co-op alternative. Because it means that the government will now be dependent for its revenue, not on the minority of capitalists who own enterprises and pay those taxes,
Right.
but on the workers themselves, their collectivity, because they are their own employer. They will be the ones who own the purse strings, if you like, upon which the government depends, and the government will therefore be much less able to be the dictator, to be the controller, because you've changed the base of the society. It means that this kind of socialism, and I don't mind telling you, the older kind, with the state as the core, that is fading. It's fading in terms of the empirical existence. It's also fading in terms of the thinking and the loyalty of socialists around the world. And the one that's coming up is this last one that I'm telling you about.
Right.
And I also think that you might find it interesting that the battle between capitalism and socialism is therefore changing, because the battle lines that were drawn in the 19th and 20th century were the battle lines between the advocates of private capitalism and what we now call the advocates of state capitalism. And so the defenses of each side against the other were built on that framework. The hostility to socialism was therefore very closely intertwined with the hostility to the state. Think about it in your own mind and in the circles you travel. Now you'll understand why the prospects for a socialism focused in completely differently on the enterprise, on the transformation of an enterprise which can be privately owned by the employer or privately owned by the worker co-op, which we already have.
Not a top-down.
That's right, bottom-up approach. This is going to be very attractive to Americans. It already is. And the right wing is not prepared to argue against it because it doesn't even know that this kind of socialism is out there. I can tell you, as I travel around the United States explaining this, I've learned this is going to be powerful. It is already powerful, not only because I think it has an intrinsic appeal, particularly in countries where the concept of democracy already has support, let's call it that way. But it's also going to be successful because the enemies of this have not yet geared up to cope with this whole new focus of what it means to be socialist.
Right. Well, we've gone an hour and a half, buddy.
Yes, yes.
I've literally gotten to zero of my questions I had written down. But man, that was a lot of fun. That was very, very fascinating. I wish I just had time to come back and give you some rebuttals to what you're talking, because it's so fascinating. But you're going to have to agree to come on again.
I was about to say, look,
yeah,
you work on this, you edit it, you see what kind of response it gets from your people. And if you think a further conversation based on what we've done today that focuses on your questions, I'm here.
Oh, that's fantastic. I would love to talk to you again. And I do interviews based on who I really am interested and fascinated to talk to. And you're definitely on the list there. So for all of my viewers and listeners who want to find out more about what you do or more about this type of socialism approach, this bottoms up where there's actually private property, where can they go to find out more about you and what you do?
I'll give you several places. Probably the best and easiest is to go to our websites. There are two of them. One of them is called Democracy at Work. That's all one word, democracyatwork.info, I-N-F-O. The second website is my own, RD Wolff with 2 F's, rdwolff.com, real simple. We do a regular weekly half-hour radio and television show. It's called Economic Update. It's available, the entire archive. We've been doing it for a decade. The entire archive is available on YouTube. You can follow us, subscribe on the YouTube channel. You just go YouTube, Democracy at Work, and you'll get all of that kind of material. There was a book I released a few years ago that goes into this whole notion of socialism as worker co-op oriented. It's also called Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism. That's the title of the book. And my latest book, which comes out in about 10 days, is called, you might enjoy this, The Sickness is the System. And it's a collection of work that I've done. But those are the way. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We have that whole apparatus going to try to make this material available.
Awesome. Well, Richard, I'm still the rebel capitalist, my friend, but I really appreciate you coming on and explaining your views and help me to understand things better. And you're a fantastic storyteller, and it's been a lot of fun. Thank you very much, and I can't wait to do it again.
Well, let me thank you also, because your openness, even though you're coming at it from a different perspective, is really all people like me ask. Give us a chance to tell what we have to say. You will decide in your own good way what is reasonable in what we say, what you agree with, what you don't agree with. And that's the kind of way we work together in a civilized society. We don't need to suffer from the blindness towards each other's views, and therefore, why in the world continue that? So I appreciate your openness to have the conversation.
Awesome. Well, enjoy your day, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right, sir. Take care.